I should start this by saying I never expected to write a book growing up. I never really had a conscious idea or fantasy about being an author or a writer. I think I fantasized a lot about maybe being an artist or being creative in some way. As when I was really young, I enjoyed kind of performing. But there was something about writing that felt like it wasn't allowed. There was something that felt a little bit taboo. And I think maybe because when I first started writing, I was a 13-year-old and I was probably extremely horny and hormonal. And I was just like, putting my fantasies down on paper and filling up notebooks with these little romance stories, stories of kind of sexual initiation for young girls. And I mean, if my mother had ever seen that, it would have just been, I don't know, the end for me. So there was something, I think, very early on that I associated with writing that was something I had to keep hidden and that was secret and that was very, very much to do with my inner world. And I went on a totally different journey toward art history. I studied art history. I think I really wanted to make art, and I felt that I couldn't. I somehow had decided in my mind that art was something other people made. I didn't really know any artists at that point. And so it felt very far, very distant. And I decided to study art history as a way of kind of circling artists. And I began doing that. And through that, I started writing about art a lot. And it was there that I noticed something coming in.
Welcome, everybody. I've been looking forward so much to this discussion. So today we have with us Avni Doshi. Avni is an author, a writer. Her debut novel was called Burnt Sugar, and in 2020 it was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. So really well done on that, Avni. So she currently lives in Dubai and she's writing her second novel. And we wanted to invite her in today to discuss with us all things creativity. So the creative process, living as a creative person, being a woman who creates. And we just want to explore this really interesting topic with Avni today. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. Both of you are, some of my favorite people in this city. So this is a treat for me.
In the world, hello.
In the world, yeah, exactly.
The feeling's mutual.
In the world.
Yeah.
Awesome. So why don't we dive in with, do you want to tell us a little bit about what it was like for you to bring forth your book? It's no small thing, right? And we're really curious as to what happened, how that was for you. Should we just dive in there?
Yeah, happy to. It was definitely a journey to write a book. And it didn't look anything like what I expected it to be. I should start this by saying I never expected to write a book growing up. I never really had a conscious idea or fantasy about being an author or a writer. I think I fantasized a lot about maybe being an artist or being creative in some way. As when I was really young, I enjoyed kind of performing. But there was something about writing that felt like it wasn't allowed. There was something that felt a little bit taboo. And I think maybe because when I first started writing, I was a 13-year-old and I was probably extremely horny and hormonal. And I was just like, putting my fantasies down on paper and filling up notebooks with these, little romance stories, stories of kind of sexual initiation for young girls. And I mean, if my mother had ever seen that, it would have just been, I don't know, the end for me. So there was something I think very early on that I associated with writing that was something I had to keep hidden and that was secret and that was very, very much to do with my inner world. And I went on a totally different journey toward art history. I studied art history. I think I really wanted to make art, and I felt that I couldn't. I somehow had decided in my mind that art was something other people made. I didn't really know any artists at that point. And so it felt very far, very distant. And I decided to study art history as a way of kind of circling artists. And I began doing that. And through that, I started writing about art a lot. And it was there that I noticed something coming in. There was this drive to not follow the kind of normal path of writing an essay about an artist or, the jargon around art criticism. That felt a little difficult for me. But these stories would come in to the art writing, this interest in the mythology, not only the mythology around the artists themselves, but often the mythology that was, in the subject matter of a work of art. And I think this desire for storytelling was just sort of bubbling. And I remember I was in India and I had already been living there for a couple of years, working in the art world. And it was like suddenly an image appeared before my eyes and it had me by the throat. And I wasn't sure if it was one face or two faces, but I could tell it was a woman. But was it one woman or was it two women? And who were they to each other? And before I knew it, these two women were just talking to each other. It was really strange. I kind of had a feeling like, am I hallucinating? Am I not okay? But I just went with it. I just kind of followed them around for a while. And before I knew it, I had, the first scene of something. And it took a while for me to realize that what I was writing was a novel and that it had this narrative that wanted to be shared, that wanted to be told. The journey to actually getting published is a whole other story because that was a kind of 7-year process where I wrote 8 different drafts. I think it was kind of like this hyper perfectionism then had me by the throat where I just, wanted it to be kind of the perfect telling of the story. Although looking back, I also wonder, something in me recognized that this story wanted to be told, but it didn't want to be told in the way that I wanted to tell it. It almost had its own intelligence. It had its own life and its own way that the story itself wanted to be expressed. And it really took a long time for me to, I would say, surrender a little bit and allow the story to reveal itself rather than kind of me trying to control it or fit it into some kind of narrative I had in my mind or some, notion of what storytelling is and what a novel is supposed to look like.
So interesting. It's really starkly different from a lot of the training we get around creativity, isn't it? Where you need to force it or push it or work for it, and it's really coming from the intellect. This is about more creativity as accessing flow state. It's like mediumship coming through. And that's a very affecting process, right?
So intuitive.
Yeah.
Like listening to you say, it's like, whoa, you like, you're saying the two ladies and you just trusted it. It's just something in you said, go with it. And I don't know, were you scared a bit?
I don't know if I trusted it. I think I was suspicious of it. especially at that time in my life when I was suspicious of everything. I was especially suspicious of anything that came out of my body. I was suspicious of a lot of my thoughts. I think I was living in a moment in my own journey when I was sort of very attached to rational thinking. I had a very vibrant dream life, but it took me a couple of years after that to even begin to pay attention to what was showing up in dreams and to even begin to imagine that there was some connection between what was happening at night and what I was living in the day. So, I mean, you can probably get a sense of how different, you guys know me. So you have a sense of how different I was then to what I am now and how differently I was living then. I was extremely suspicious. It was something I felt like, what am I even going to do with this? I couldn't even trust that what I was writing was a novel. It almost felt like I was kind of releasing something impure or unholy or something, or very strange. Sometimes because I began writing the novel in my grandmother's house. My grandmother, who passed away last year, was just the love of my life. And she was an amazing cook, and she just brought the family together in her house around food. And I remember in her house so much, it was just so fertile in that house. There was just always images and smells and things coming up and beautiful fabric. And, she was just such a creative force that I think, it was impossible not to feel that around her. But it was in her house. And I thought maybe I was tapping into something in the house, some energy or something that had happened in that house at some point. But I wasn't sure what. But yeah, it was intuitive, but my ego was not really trusting it at all.
But you still followed.
Yeah, I had no choice, as I said. I really felt like it had me by the throat. And, it's funny, like over the years, I've really come to the work of, psychologists and philosophers like Carl Jung and James Hillman. And I really feel strongly that this notion of the daimon is so real, that there is this kind of autonomous thing inside of us that has some kind of plan. And I did really feel like I don't have a choice. Like I have to do something with this or it's going to do something to me. There was kind of a bit of a showdown in a way. I didn't think it would go anywhere. So for me, it was, my rational kind of Capricorn self was thinking, well, what am I going to do with this? What is this? This is taking me away from my study of art history, from my art writing, from curating exhibitions. And it found its way in, because before I knew it, I was curating exhibitions about novels. It wasn't even about art anymore. It was like I was focused on the novel. And the exact same themes, I would choose novels with the exact same themes that I was exploring in my own creative writing.
Wow.
Yeah.
I love how you just, even though there was like fear or story or whatever, you still went to it. Yeah, you said like you were held by the throat and there was all those stories, but you still you still showed up and the world still unfolded for you the way it was meant to. And it's just I'm just thinking about how in life, like especially growing up and when you get educated in such a rigid system and a very critical, like a certain way of thinking, on some level, some part of your creativity just goes, or at least I can say for myself, goes inwards. You don't even, like when you're younger, you dream, you talk to yourself, you play some random ass shit that it's just very, whatever calls you. And then somewhere along the line, as you get older, schooling, that kind of gets put in a box and says, khalas, like that's done. Now, go do life and go do it this way. And I think that, I don't know, dreamer, whatever it is, part of you gets closed down. And I think being in touch with it we should never put it in a box. We should always be in touch with that. We should always be playing.
Yeah, it's like all beings are creative beings, but we get taught that creativity looks like being good at art or being a musician or being
Painter.
like exceptionally talented at usually a visual or a performance art. And that's it. And everybody else sits in the category of non-creatives. It's really sad, and like you brought up Hillman before, that idea of the acorn, that's somewhere, or we could say the daimon, like that some part of you knows what you've come to contribute. And usually as a little child, you don't have the ego defenses against that. And so nothing's blocking it. And so I was just as you were talking, I was actually flashing back to a memory that I've not had before, and it just came to me from childhood, really, just now. And I totally forgot I used to do this. It's very relevant to what we're doing right now. I used to go around with my cassette recorder, that ages me, and I used to go around to people and press record and interview them and make interviews on tapes of interesting subjects. I used to interview my friends. I used to interview my family and my parents, where I'd be the interviewer. Yeah, and I totally forgot that.
Wow.
Until this minute. But as a kid, we just explore this and we're just in touch with it. But yeah, I get what Dana's getting at, like the moving past the mind with its blocks to who am I to write a novel? Who am I to do that? Like that takes some faith and surrender and some guts. Yeah.
I think you said something really interesting, which is like we shouldn't put that kind of, spirit in a box. And I think, there's a place for all of it. It's almost like there has to, I think, at some point be a dance between that deep inner resistance and that surrender. And I think the more you resist, strangely enough, the surrender is kind of more profound and beautiful. And I find also like the notion of the daimon, to push it even further, this notion of this acorn, this blueprint that we all have within us that then eventually grows into this oak tree that you just could never imagine. Like when you hold that acorn in your hand and you see it out of context, could you ever imagine that that enormous tree can emerge from that? And that's sort of how we are. And I think even with children, it's really strange and funny because I have 2 children and I do this with my own kids. Parents will sometimes say, what can I do to encourage my child? And I think about it myself. The other day I was discussing, with my ex-husband that, the kids, our son is so good at piano. And for a moment I sat there and I thought, oh my gosh, he's so good at piano. How can I encourage him? And then I thought, well, if I really want him to be good at piano, maybe I should discourage him, because I feel in a way the resistance of the parent can even be something very beautiful for the child to engage with. That block from the parent can also be, and we think of it in very black and white terms that, you have to support your child. And I think New Age parenting is great, but I think there's something to be said about the fact that you have to give your children something to collide against. That really gives them form, And I think my parents were great, but they were not big readers. They were definitely not writers. They never said, they didn't, it's not that they wouldn't educate me. They were very big on educating me, but literature was never anything in our house. It's nothing in my family. Maybe I think, one of my grandfathers was interested in literature, but it was not really something he directly passed down to me. And in fact, I've told this story before, but, my grandmother, who I was very close to, she never really studied much. And so her writing and reading ability was very limited, almost none. She, was sort of, in fact, they told her when she was young that, oh, you're practically illiterate. You know, how will you raise your own children? And it was sort of the premise on which my grandfather sent all his children to boarding school, because how would their mother raise them since she wasn't educated? And it's almost as if this is sort of the thing that is alive in me. It's the resistance. You know, it's almost like the not having that I think in my situation at least created this deep desire. And, you know, you can think of it as a kind of, I like to think of it as an attempt at wholeness, because it's not just that we find wholeness in ourselves, but I think there's a sort of collective, a kind of collective sea we're all tapped into. And when you're in a place or a family or a city or a community that pushes everything so far in one direction, whether that's the rational, whether that's, you know, a maybe more mechanical or mathematical way of thinking, there's a way that that other side is sort of empty and calling you. You know, there's this void there that just draws you in, that you kind of want to rush into and fill with everything inside of you. And so I think even in families, it's interesting for me, and it comes into my writing a lot, because I write primarily about families and intimate relationships and domestic spaces, especially how, you know, we think about home as this warm, cozy place, but actually the home is full of domestic monsters. So I'm really interested in domestic monsters, but how even within that kind of domestic space, there are these gaps, and we're all kind of born, you know, maybe for the purpose of filling those gaps. Like where were my parents, you know, not able to express themselves? And that kind of desire for expression can arise in me.
It's so interesting, because I think about this like as a therapist, you know, we learn from what our parents taught us, and we learn probably even more from where our parents weren't able to do something or give us something or demonstrate something or hold something together. And this is the really humbling truth of being a parent, because that's not just our parents, that's also us as parents. Our children will learn heaps from what we do right, and they'll learn even more from what we do wrong. And this is where there's sort of, I think there's a certain kind of almost narcissistic parenting style that's being pushed onto people, that, you know, it's sort of parenting of striving. Like if you read enough and know enough and you can be the perfect parent, you're not meant to sit at the center. Your child's at the center. You're a bit player. And yeah, you'll screw up, and that'll give them what they need. And that's the karmic contract, you know. But this kind of more humble part of being a parent, yeah, a lot of people are defended against that because there's guilt or there's shame or there's fear, but it's actually the way of things. And so, yeah, those vacuums, we need them, because into that space rushes our contribution, what we're here to develop, and we needed that family system with that space in it.
And I sometimes think, my God, thank goodness my parents were not like, you know, extremely sophisticated in their choice of literature, or like extremely brilliant writers, you know, by themselves, because I might have found that so intimidating. Yeah, like we have to, I think our parents offer us not only something to embrace, but something to deeply reject. And I think that's beautiful. Like I almost love that about my parents, you know, that all they've given me to reject. They've kind of allowed me to really see myself in that as well. And I think that's deeply fed into my creative process, and also the subject matter that really interests me. But it's interesting what you say about, you know, you had mentioned a minute ago about how we have these strict parameters about creativity and who's allowed to be creative. And, you know, if you make art, then you're an artist. And I notice the more I write and the more I spend time with writing, the more I don't really feel the urge to call myself a writer. You know, of course, I will call myself a writer in certain conversations because I, feed into the desire other people have to kind of situate me or categorize me. But if I really sit with myself, I often think that I don't do that much writing. I do a lot more thinking. I do a lot more mothering. I do a lot more walking. Am I any of those things? Am I a walker? I am those things, but I'm also not those things. The other day somebody asked me like, "Are you an artist?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm an artist." And I had never called myself an artist. And I sort of gave myself the permission to call myself an artist. And that felt exhilarating and strange. And it felt so beautiful to like just try on a category and an identity very effortlessly, very lightly, just wear it for a little while. And then also feel free that, after that interaction ended, I could put it down. I could forget about it, or I could go deeper with it. I could say, well, what would that mean if, or maybe maybe that says something about what I'm feeling. Maybe, that came up because I feel like exploring art in a different capacity than I have. So I like the idea of being creative in the way we think about creativity and being creative in the way we think about creative identity and being able to try things on and take them off and also allowing ourselves to move between, we call them these disciplines like, oh, are you an interdisciplinary artist? Or, are you a writer and this and that? And it's just like, I don't know what I am. Like I'm something maybe today and I might be something different tomorrow. And I think that's really what I've found creativity is about.
I have a question for both of you because you're both English, very English literate. What is an actual artist? Because how I understood artist all my life was a painter, and like what you said, I'm not a painter, I'm not a singer, so I ain't those things. But I think artist is much more than that. So I'm actually curious, what is an artist?
I mean, if you enter the art world, they'll have one answer for you. If you're kind of in a gallery or in a museum, then that, you would have to belong to some kind of canon. And some people will say, well, did you go to art school? And if you didn't go to art school, then maybe you're outside of the canon. And then are you some kind of outsider artist? So there's like a huge desire to like put labels on everyone. There are conceptual artists, who don't really make anything, who kind of work out of offices and kind of facilitate events or happenings or interventions. So art, I mean, if you look at the art world as it stands today, the art, what it is to be an artist and art has become such a huge topic and such a huge word with so many different meanings that it almost means nothing in a way. But then I think, there are artists who say things like, well, to be human is to be an artist, and to be alive is to be an artist. And there are even artists today who say that, well, even inanimate, even the inanimate beings and creatures around us have a kind of almost an aesthetic or some kind of artistic beingness just by, just because of the fact that they exist. And so it's such a big question, actually, and a deeply philosophical, theoretical question on one hand. But if you ask me intuitively, I mean, according to me, if you're human, you're creative. Everything you do in life can be art if you choose to think of it that way. If the way you wake up in the morning, the way you make your tea, the way you make your bed, the way you dress or shower or engage with your children. I see art as a kind of, I see it as a choice we make, like a choosing. I felt it was almost a kind of work of art, or there was something deeply creative in the way I engaged with my daughter yesterday. You know, we were having an interaction, and I felt myself kind of getting triggered. And I kind of decided in the moment that I'm not going to kind of get upset or, you know, get worried that we're running behind schedule. I'm just going to take a moment and like observe her and be with her and be in reverence to the moment and enjoy her. And like there was a way in which my whole experience of time shifted in that moment. I had this deep realization that she's going to be this age for a very short time. And suddenly, like everything else in the day shifted. And it was just kind of me and her in that moment, and her way of being shifted as well. So for me, creativity is really powerful because it doesn't just come from one person, you know? If you imagine there's a kind of collective field between us, I think a creative impulse coming from one direction, it sort of lights up that entire field. And it you know, something is alive then, not just in me and around me, but for the other person as well.
I'm thinking when you're saying now about creativity and art, and I agree with you, like there's an art in how I wake up in the morning. There's an art in how you make love. And there's an art in like everything, and that art is unique to you.
Yeah.
And there's an art in how I coach. And that art is unique to me and ever evolving. And like what you were saying about your daughter, but I think there's something around slowing down and observing and getting to know yourself really, and that helps you refine that art and make art.
And also breaking rules.
Yeah.
Like we've got all these rules about language, right? About what you're allowed to label yourself, what you're able to story yourself.
Yeah.
And especially for women, I think there's a lack of permission that can come in on claiming some of these more archetypal words like artist or, this. And I think there's a great freedom and support to a person's mental and emotional health when they start to, like you were saying, try on, put down, like just get more flexible with how they're going to story their existence. I mean, the amount of times that I hear women say, I'm just a mum. Like, one, that's a great thing to be, but you aren't that. Like you're not, that's not your identity. Like, so I think if you even take artist or writer or whatever as an identity, I think we're in a problematic zone there. But when you're engaging with that archetype, when you're engaging with whatever that means to you behaviorally, I think you can get back in touch with a more enchanted narrative of your life. And I think this is very important, where you're broadening that. But I've noticed this, especially women, I've noticed that sometimes maybe the conditioning that men receive, they're more confident to claim some of these labels publicly. They're less worried about what's going to come at them, perhaps. Whereas I've noticed for women, they get pretty vulnerable about, is it okay for me to say? I mean, basically a writer writes, an artist produces art. Like it's that basic, right? So every one of us could be a writer if we sit and write during the day, which most of us do. But the permission, I'm a writer, and the vulnerability around that, I don't know, I see it in women.
I've been on quite a journey with that because I think before I was published, it was very hard for me to call myself a writer and to own this kind of writing life or like to, in my imagination, there was a world, there was a room, and I was kind of, waiting outside in line. The bouncer was like checking my ID and was like, no, you don't look good enough. You're not, it was that kind of a feeling.
Screening.
I was waiting for entry into this world. And I think pretty much any writer you ask, any writer you ask about that will say, yes, before I was published, I did feel this great doubt about calling myself a writer. I think, even once you're published, you kind of have this imposter syndrome that keeps turning up and you're wondering, I mean, even me right now, I have days. I had a really funny conversation with my wonderful editor, Hermione in the UK, and she, I said, I'm just having a lot of doubts. And she said, uh-huh. She's like, do you think the first novel was a fluke? And I was like, yes. And she was like, yeah. Do you think it was an accident? Like you just woke up one day and it just kind of, this novel came out and now, you have to produce a second one. And it's like, oh God, people are going to find out that first one happened by accident and it was just a mistake. She's like, is that what you're feeling? And I was like, yeah. She's like, yeah, I hear this once a week. She's like, everybody writes, everybody keeps writing, but everybody goes through this after the first book. And so it's a very common thing that I think happens to a lot of writers. Where I think the journey has kind of brought me full circle is that I began with this anxiety around claiming that title or label for myself. And then I think I got a bit more comfortable and confident about it. I started using it more in public. I would go into a room and say, hi, I'm a writer, this is my work. And I would get a lot of praise. I would get attention. People started calling me the writer. They said, oh yeah, Avni, the writer, my writer friend, and so then there was this kind of, oh, like, that's me. And then it started turning another corner because I began to really recognize that the meanness that I had sort of clung to at the center of this was really starting to dissolve. And that when I am writing, there's very little I, there's very little writer, and there's very little me present. And I began to notice more and more that for me, writing is really an act of devotion. And it's really about turning up, and I think there are like so many beautiful images in Sufism about this. It's about really turning up and emptying myself of all the Avniness, all the I-ness, all the me-ness, all the writerness, and just allowing myself to be filled with story and whatever wants to be told and whatever wants to tell itself, so that I am no longer telling the story, but the story is telling itself and I am a vessel of sorts. And, I think some people get really uncomfortable with this kind of deep spiritualizing of the process. But this is what I've found to be true. There's a deep forgetting of the me-ness and the I-ness. The writer isn't there when I'm writing. When I'm deep in the story, the writer is not there. And I don't even feel like I'm there. I feel I lose sense of time, space. I hear voices. I see things that I know are not really around me. And I think that I realized in kind of really coming, and there was a way maybe that is so not rational, and that takes that creative agency, because we just want to be the creative agents in our lives. And it feels disempowering sometimes when you hear it, or it feels like you're not taking responsibility, or you're not wanting to acknowledge, or people might even say the opposite, that as a woman, oh, you're downplaying yourself. I don't think so. I don't think of this as downplaying myself. I'm telling you that I think I'm a vessel for some kind of divine storytelling. I don't think of that as downplaying myself.
Falsely modest.
I think in a way I'm kind of like self-aggrandizing, and it's so deeply relieving. And I think that, that loss of the I of the writer and that loss of that clinging to identity has been so freeing. And it's given me the lightness and the playfulness to then say, oh, well, if I can write and even like leave that identity of the writer at the door, then what other identities can I maybe try on sometimes? And then what can I do with that identity on? And does that identity also disappear when I do other things? So sometimes when I'm with my kids and I think, oh, I'm mother with my kids mothering, I forget that I'm their mom sometimes. And those are the best moments. I'm just having fun, like with them. There was a moment a couple of days ago, I was with my son and I was just, I'm a nerd. So he and I are both nerds and we love talking about fossils and we love talking about constellations and stargazing and astronomy and then we love the mythology as well around all of that. And he wanted to know about carbon dating and I was nerding out and I forgot all responsibility. I forgot that he had to eat his dinner. I forgot that he had to have his bath. I forgot that, he has school on Friday. I just started messaging this paleontologist I know. And I was like, can me and my son come on Friday and, just come and we want to look at this. And he was so excited and I was excited and even the paleontologist was excited. And I forgot everything about being a mom. And I was just so present and alive with my son. And we were just so excited and in the moment. And that's life to me. Like that's the best part of life. And those are the best parts of my work as well when I'm writing or when I'm making something or when I'm engaging in creative work. It's when I forget the I and the me and who I am and how I'm supposed to show up and what I might represent and what people might call me. Like when all of that vanishes and I'm just in the present with whatever is kind of arising. That fire, that libido, whatever you want to call it, that energy, that attention, that spark. That's when, I feel my most creative and when I feel my most alive. And that's the kind of life I want to be living every day as much as possible. So yeah.
Me
That's
too.
amazing.
Definitely. I'm just listening to you and I'm like, fuck yeah,
That's the therapeutic goal, at least the type of therapy that I am engaged in is how do you get people to release this sense of identity, this sense of I, so they're being showing up in the world with all of their energy, with all of their presence. And you will always see amazing things come out of people when they can get to that space, when they can surrender to that space. But from the time we can speak where we're just so conditioned to have an ego, to have an identity, to defend it, to uphold it, to improve it, to story it, to tell people about it. You can have this one, but you can't have this one. This one's a better one. Maybe one day you'll get that one if you can work hard enough, like the shame and the guilt and all the conditioning that you get around that. It just overemphasizes that aspect of self, the egoic self or the small self. And I think especially around midlife, if people don't start dismantling that when they hit the crisis, and if they don't start that journey of dismantling that and letting that go, by the time they move into old age, they become very fear-based and living in this very rigid and small way because you have to defend that ego in a world that's making you irrelevant. And that's, it's a whole other topic, but I think creative pursuits, which can be anything, give you the raw materials for practicing this in real life. Because it's super important.
I was just thinking that when you're saying about age, because you got that nudge, right? And that creative nudge or whatever. And I feel a lot of people get it at different times. And I think people get scared of it sometimes and then just shove that in. And I feel remember like what you were saying, it had you at the throat. And I think people get scared of that and then just kind of try to put it in a box and are in that fight. And I feel if you don't lean into it and surrender to it, it will get you. And I don't know if it'll get you in the nice way,
I think I was probably really attached to identity. And I think I kind of had to learn a little bit the hard way. I was really attached to the identity of wife, and then one day I woke up and my marriage was over and I had no sort of inkling that was, and one can argue that now looking back, it's clear that there were signs or there were issues, but at the time I felt as though I had been completely stripped of this thing that was the most important part of my identity, because I think more than mother, more than writer, I prided myself on that one. And I thought in a way that that was the one that made me a good woman, you know? Like if everything else falls away, or even if I don't have kids, I'm still kind of a good woman if I'm a wife. I don't know where that came from. But anyway, and so in a way, that the loss of that kind of primary identity, and then kind of understanding that, oh, but I'm still here, and I'm still real, and I'm still, you know, having meaningful relationships and doing beautiful things, and I can still have a full life, and I can still be, you know, the person I want to be and live my values and be completely authentic. That was sort of a revelation. And once I had that, I said, well, all of these identities must be meaningless then.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all of them must be kind of actually pretty fluid.
Mm.
All of them must be more to make other people comfortable, you know, and not really have anything to do with who I am. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a way when change appears, and especially I think it happens to everyone in some form at midlife. You know, I'm a big believer in that. It can be scary. You can really want to run away and say, well, or cling, you know, or cling or be unwilling to change. You can become sort of calcified and rigid, you know, in your way of doing things. And I really think in a way, my biggest sort of trials and tribulations have, and my biggest sort of identity crises have been the things that have pushed me deeper into creativity. And they've pushed me deeper into self-reflection and introspection. And I think back to the moments where I hit rock bottom. And those were the biggest gifts, because there was nothing left. You know, everything had shattered. Every ideal, everything had shattered. And then I really got to question, well, now who do I want to be today? And what do I want to be today? And I really had a chance to interrogate that question in a real way, you know, to the point where I sometimes think like I could wake up tomorrow and write a film script if I wanted.
Yeah.
I could make a movie. Maybe I want to take pictures, you know? Maybe I want to paint something or play with clay, or maybe I want to take up a sport, or maybe I want to start singing again like I did when I was a child, or maybe I want to, you know, my grandmother used to like crochet and embroider. Maybe I want to try to do that. And this is where I think surrounding yourself with women or men or anyone who is curious, like I'm really lucky I have you guys around me, and I have other incredibly curious humans around me. And I notice when there's that kind of creative jealousy that shows up, when my friend is doing something amazing, creative, like some amazing creative project or work, and I'm like, oh, I want to do that too, you know? And it's not, of course, not that I don't want my friend to do it, but I realize that thing of doing something new, and it may not even be to do the same thing that they're doing, but just that starting something completely new, really with that true beginner's mind of like, I could just do anything now. I'm going to keep falling and making a mistake, and I'm going to make a mess here. And there's no past that is going to kind of, you know, stand there in judgment of what I produce. You know, there's no kind of precedent that I have to live up to. That's become really exciting to me, watching what the amazing people around me are doing. I even find it extremely creative to bring people together who I think there's some synergy maybe between them or the work they're doing, and maybe they're from different aspects of my life. And introducing them and seeing the spark emerge between two people. I especially love to do that with women. So that also feels like another way in which I'm kind of expanding creatively.
It's like there's nothing that's not creative, really.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is making me think about that, what Jung said about midlife, where it's the opportunity for women, healthily met, that crisis, to connect with voice. So that's all about these outputs. What are you going to give to the world? And for men, to turn inward and connect with the heart. So to rebalance in their emotional self at midlife, right? But think about what we're told to do. We hit the crisis and women are encouraged to double down on their caretaking and their supportive roles. And men are encouraged to double down on chasing success and validation in the external world, the opposite of that move. And, and we all can see how this can go. But like when you're saying, I might want to take pictures, or I might want to sing, or I might want to, to me, that's indicative of having used your crisis well and found the voice. And yeah, you need to be in community to do this, because it is, the whole world will say, don't have a voice to a woman, really. Yeah.
And I think the world will tell you not to trust your gut.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, there's been a lot of that, like a lot of people telling me, why do you want to do that? That's so crazy. That's so out there. Like, no, do it this way. No, this is better. No, the trend is moving in this direction. And so much, I think you're exactly right about finding the voice and kind of putting the voice out there. But I think also as women, the other side of that is we are kind of cut off at the necks a little bit from our bodies, from our instincts, from that kind of like knowing, and I think I had to have children to get back in touch with that, because being a mother, according to me, is like, it's all instinct. I don't think there's any kind of rule that I can follow that has really worked. I think for me, it's just about being in my, Mary Oliver talks about like the soft animal of your body. I think it's really about being in that animal of my body and like relating to my children. And I've just started to bring that more and more into my relationship with everything externally. And, like I really asked, and I never did this. And it's so crazy to me now that I never did this. I never did this my entire life. And I suffered from like terrible stomach pain all my life. And it was literally, I think, my gut yelling at me, like, pay attention to me, But now the first thing I do is I just notice, what am I feeling in my stomach? Is something trying to talk? If I'm in a situation, if I'm having a conversation with somebody, if I'm about to sign a contract, if I'm about to get on a Zoom call, like what, the same way that the maybe the writing or the books or the stories kind of get channeled, I think, other things get channeled in too. And they, seat themselves in different places. And it's important to, I think, just start to notice that. And again, I think that can be deeply life-changing. And that changed everything for me at midlife. Because you know what it was? It's, again, it goes back to the kind of dissolution of the marriage and the divorce and all of that, and that complete crisis where I felt that I had followed all the rules. And I felt I had followed all the rational thinking and the advice from the outside world. And I had done all the things a good girl should do. And this is what I was left with. I was left with kind of, the ashes of my former life. And I just said to myself, well, this doesn't fucking work.
Yeah.
Like this isn't, this was all kind of a lie. Like that any of these rules have any basis in any reality at all. And that was kind of a crazy moment to me where I think for a little while, and I'm also a kind of astrology fan. And I think that was sort of the height of my my Neptune square, that like real disillusionment where I was just like, oh my God, all the veils have dropped. And it's like, what have I been living all this time? What rules have I been living? None of this holds true.
Yeah, and you know, I can relate to you about motherhood. Motherhood was for me, because before that, like you know how you held being a wife as an identity. For me, I held being like I need to be at the top of the corporate ladder and be this and be that to as an identity. And I think subconsciously for me it was about making my father proud of me, and like also my mom on some level, even though I don't think necessarily they asked it, but I guess that was where the praise came, and I wanted to show that I can make it. And I was like fighting an uphill battle because I don't think I really enjoyed it. And it's when I moved here and I didn't have a job and I just started exploring random shit here and there that I was just curious to try for a long time. But it was scary because it's like, who am I? What am I? And I found myself keep going to look back for jobs where I can go back in that identity of what I thought. But deep inside, I just didn't want it, and I got pregnant. And getting pregnant was the best gift ever because I remember when after I did all the courses to teach myself how to be a good parent, okay? And then my mom was like, by the way, this is useless. You're not going to learn anything because when push comes to shove, you're going to have to figure out yourself. And she was fucking right. My anxiety level was, and it was, and the lady used to keep telling me, trust your intuition, trust your intuition. And I swear I wanted to slap her. I mean, Miskina, she had good intentions, but I was like, what intuition? Where is that? Where do I go here? Do I go here? Where do I get it? And that was when,
Yeah, what organ is that?
yeah, like where do I acquire it? Who do I pay for it?
Yeah.
Like what? And that, whoa, it was such a challenging journey, but I wouldn't have it any other way. Because then that forced me to really get in touch with me, and in getting in touch with me, what does light me on fire? Like, what does me like? What does me feel like doing right now at this moment? And maybe what I feel like doing right now in this moment might not be tomorrow what I want to do, and allowing it without giving it a name or a meaning or because that was my old conditioning, right? Like this has to be, okay, you like this, then you have to be a specialist, then you have to be good at this, and you have to do, but maybe I like this up to a certain point and then I don't like it anymore. And that's okay.
Well, everything gets hooked to work.
Yeah.
Everything gets hooked to achievement. And it's like creativity is joy. It's bliss. Like a creative day, if I'm in a creative mode, that's my best day. Like that means I'm enjoying my day. There's so much pleasure in it. And that's actually when I know I'm in the flow. If I'm in a place of sort of self-approval because I'm achieving, it's not usually creativity. Because I think the joy element of it is, even when it's painful, even when it's bittersweet, it's enjoyable. It
feels so good.
Yeah. And
because the flow feels good.
It does. And that's but we've been taught to produce and to be able to show something for ourselves. And I think that's also fine, but it's a different beast, and I think this is where people kind of get trouble with maybe claiming creative as a way of being, because I think it's linked to producing somehow.
But I think that also is connected to not trusting that this is coming through you.
Yeah.
Because there's a way in which, I need to be productive and I need to make this into something. And I think if you put your hands up and, like the Sufis talk about turning your face toward God. And if you just kind of take that sort of, even if you're not a believer in God, if you kind of just take that as a sort of a metaphor of how, like the direction in which you have to look, and just kind of allow and allow and allow. I often think what happens is something is produced, but it's almost produced not because of you, but in spite of you. Like it is something that wants to come into being. And it's almost like a gestational process. It's almost like, again, my Taurus moon, it's kind of like a fruit coming, like ripening on the tree. And I think it requires all of those ways of seeing and thinking. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we're so disconnected from the natural world and that we live in a time when our entire relationship to nature is about extraction and commodification, that then we kind of turn that way of seeing and being on ourselves and our children and our communities and our friends, you know? And I think, you know, it can feel dangerous to people when you talk like this, because it's like, well, what are you talking about? Are you like an anarchist? What are you trying to say? Like, what, you know, you're just never going to make anything? Are you just kind of going to be like this loser who doesn't actually do anything and make anything? And yeah, it's just, you know, but at some point there's this, and again, I think there's some connection to midlife and the alchemy that takes place there, you know, that kind of, that being in the container and the, you know, just everything being stripped away layer by layer by layer, that what emerges eventually is just completely stripped of all of this. And it's so funny, like recently I have conversations with people and they talk about all the things that they want to achieve, and it's great. Like, or, you know, I'm not talking about writers, I'm talking actually about business people who talk about all the things they want to buy and achieve. And it's funny how everything I want in the world is actually becoming less and smaller and simpler. And I think, you know, for another person, it might look like, wow, she's really given up. Like she's really given up on life. You know, she doesn't want to achieve anything anymore. She's really given up on a lot of her ambition. I don't know. I don't know really. Ambition has become more and more nebulous to me as a concept. I don't even know really how to define ambition so much anymore. So I don't really think about it as much anymore. But for me, it's more about, I just am noticing the desire and where the desire is taking me. And it's very simple things. You know, it's a small house with just enough room for me and my two kids and nothing else. And maybe just like a lot of bookshelves and like just really the bare minimum stuff. You know, I think, I mean, I grew up in a very different way. And now I feel like this deep desire to pull back and pare back.
It's that difference between, like, we're told there's a there. Like I'm thinking about in therapy, right? People come into therapy in this. It's like, let's get together and figure this out. And I think the creative way is let's sit together and find this out. You know, let's let something emerge in the space and something coming through. But, you know, this idea of what we're meant to achieve in a human life, you know, like there's a there that we've got to get to. When life is an experience just to be had, I think when people do the radical act of letting go of that concept that I'm here to achieve something, paradoxically, they start achieving a lot because they just tap into their ability to uplift moments or bring things through or have a creative response. And that enhances the experience of life. Yeah. And then I think, you know, we just look at little babies to see kind of the naturalistic way to live. You know, we share, we connect, we have a huge propensity for joy, we're honest in our emotional self-expression, and we feel part of things, you know. And then all of the minding and ego we get taught to do, if we can start to really work with that and let it go, that's our potential. And it's not up to us that's the other thing. We think we can make ourselves be who we're meant to be, but that's there's something that's a bit written here about what your contribution is going to be as well, that acorn, you know, and having a deep acceptance and love for that. That's not better that you wrote a book and that you do something else. They're the same goodness, you know, but regardless of what we're taught, but we are taught to value some things more than others. So yeah, this is a fascinating. I think we need to do a part 2 on this one.
Yeah, because now all I'm
It's
thinking
just too
about
big
is
because we've run out of time. We
Yeah.
need to wrap up, but I think we need to do a part 2.
especially what you said about ambition. I'm exploring that word too, because I feel as well there's something attached to it that is not really us. It's some narrative we've taken around worth, and that's what will make me worthy.
And I think also
You know,
what you were
I wanna
just
explore that.
saying about this notion of a there and a ladder to climb and a place to reach. If you begin to reject that, then, or you begin to see that that doesn't really hold purchase for you anymore. Everything you kind of judged in your life, that too, like those judgments begin to dissolve, like the whole nature of what you might think of as failure.
Yeah.
You know, because there's a way in which, for example, I mean, I didn't even talk about this, but I spent 7 years writing my book, and there were 8 drafts. And each time I wrote a draft, I would get to the end, I would read it, and I would say, well, this is a piece of shit. I can't send this to anyone or give this to anyone. And I would kind of throw it out. And I would kind of go through a little depression and, you know, tell everybody, maybe I would drink too much. And then I would tell everybody, you know, like, I'm not going to write another one. I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to go back to the art stuff. And again, a couple of months would pass and I would start another draft. And looking back on that, you can be like, wow, you really messed up a lot in there. Or you can think, you know, wow, what a journey, and how that was all such an integral part of the process, and how to write the final draft in the form it came through in, I had to experience all of those tellings, and I had to, you know, enter the story in all of those various points of view. And I had to have that exploration to feel that my characters were as psychologically autonomous as I began to feel they were at the end.
So it was absolutely necessary. But from a linear kind of conditioned mind response, you were just a failed writer for a long time. You know, like
I couldn't figure it out. She just couldn't nail
figure
it.
it out. We're going to wrap up. Yeah. So part 2 to be
Yes,
continued.
to be continued.
Awesome.
Yes. Thank you so much for coming.